On 16 July 2021, Pope Francis issued a motu proprio entitled Traditionis Custodes, and it's gotten a lot of attention. It has to do with the way Catholics celebrate Mass, and its implications are pretty significant. Francis says that the Mass as celebrated according to the liturgical books promulgated by Pope Paul VI and revised under the authority of Pope John Paul II are, and I quote, the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. I'm Dr. Richard Bolzachelli for Catholic Studies Academy, and in this video I'm going to explain what this phrase might mean and why it may be the single most significant phrase in the whole document. But before we get started, you could help us accomplish our mission if you just hit that thumbs up button, like and subscribe, get notified of future content, and share our content on social media. So, let's get started. In Traditionis Custodes, Pope Francis has effectively set the usus antiquior on a path to extinction. Now, if you've never heard that phrase before, the usus antiquior is a formal way of identifying the celebration of Mass and other related liturgical ceremonies according to the books in use in the Latin or Roman Rite of Catholicism prior to 1970. The more recent books, by contrast, are known as the Novus Ordo, or New Order of the Liturgy. The Mass of the Novus Ordo, the Novus Ordo Missae, is sometimes called the Mass of Pope Paul VI because he was the Pope under whom the new liturgical books were promulgated. Now, as for the usus antiquior, you've probably heard people refer to it as the traditional Latin Mass, or TLM for short. I don't call it that because I don't see the use of Latin to be its distinguishing element. There's nothing in principle to prevent the Pope or the local bishops' conferences from introducing translations of the usus antiquior, however much certain enthusiasts might object, and the official books of the Mass of Pope Paul VI are themselves published in Latin. Pope Benedict referred to the usus antiquior as the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, but later in this video we'll see why that phrase may no longer be applicable. And it's a big deal not only on a practical level for devotees of the usus antiquior, but also quite possibly at a doctrinal level. To be fair to Pope Francis, there have always been certain devotees to the usus antiquior who thought the Novus Ordo seriously defective. Some refuse to acknowledge its validity. In other words, they refuse to acknowledge that Christ is made truly and sacramentally present in the consecration through the celebration of the Novus Ordo. Others have held that the Novus Ordo is technically valid, that it is the Mass, as a matter of fact, but that it's so deficient as an expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite that even as it makes the Blessed Sacrament truly present, it communicates a fundamentally Protestant theology. According to Pope Francis, his decision to suppress the usus antiquior is made with the intention of depriving that contingent of self-identifying Catholics any further quarter in the liturgical life of the Church, so as to curb the spread of a divisive heresy that rejects the Second Vatican Council as, in principle, derogating from the faith rather than articulating it through authoritative and, in certain cases, infallible teaching. These groups, however, have always been on the fringes, even among devotees to the usus antiquior, and Francis' sweeping move is like a weapon of mass destruction. Pun intended, it makes no distinction between this tiny fringe element and the countless other faithful Catholics who've rediscovered their faith in the context of the usus antiquior, or just discovered it in the first place. Many of these are rather young. They're a youth thirsting for a religion that offers a palpable link to the past, and in so doing, reminds them, in the midst of a culture of disposability and constant fleeting change, that there's more to what matters in life than what was invented yesterday or will happen tomorrow. In many places, these communities have been the fastest growing in their regions and have produced a disproportionate number of vocations. So by setting the usus antiquior on a path to extinction, Pope Francis objectively denies some of the most faithful and committed members of the Church the liturgical form they found most nourishing in their spiritual and moral growth as Catholics. Catholics who accept the teachings of the Second Vatican Council and object not to liturgical reform, but to liturgical abuse, moral and doctrinal ambiguity, and the sense that anything that happened in the Church before the Second Vatican Council just doesn't matter anymore. These people aren't the radicals Francis claims to be opposing. They believe that the church that exists today and the church that existed in 1962 or in 1870 or in 1570 are the same church, and that the way people prayed in the past shouldn't just be erased from the life of the church in our time because something new has come along. They explicitly resist the view that the usus antiquior belongs to a different church or a different faith. That's why they think it should stay. Ironically, however, in the way he characterizes the Novus Ordo, and therefore the usus antiquior, Pope Francis paints himself into a corner in which he finds himself basically ceding the point of the radical fringe he seeks to crush, no matter the collateral damage to these other souls. So, how has he done this? In Traditionis Custodes, Pope Francis refers to the Missale Romanum of Pope Paul VI, again, instituted in 1970, as, once more I'm quoting him, the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. That phrase carries massive theological implications. Maybe he just chose the wrong words here, but if he meant what he said, well, let's just hope he didn't. So let's examine this statement because this is a really serious claim. The Novus Ordo is the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. What does Francis mean by the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite, and what could it mean to say that the Mass of Paul VI is its unique expression? Well, the phrase Lex Orandi is a Latin phrase that basically means the law of praying. Now, what it means to say that the Missale Romanum of 1970 is the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite isn't clearly stated in the document, nor, I would say, in its explanatory note. I'll put links to each of them in the description below, but on the face of it, it sounds as if Francis is saying that there's only one form of Roman liturgy in the Latin Rite, and it's the liturgy instituted in 1970. If that's so, then Benedict's phrase, extraordinary form, no longer seems meaningful. If there's only one recognized form of liturgy in the Roman Rite, and that form is the Mass of Pope Paul VI, then prior forms can't really even be seen as extraordinary. What are they then? I don't pretend to know. Francis doesn't say. But that's not the most significant issue. Even if we say that Francis wishes to suspend a venerable form of liturgical celebration in the Roman Rite, and permit the Roman Rite to celebrate liturgy only under the form of the Novus Ordo, which would be a purely legal act affecting church discipline, Francis' wording takes us much further than that. Francis is certainly saying that the usus antiquior is to be phased out of use, and in that way rendered extinct in the years to come. That could be the whole meaning of what he says. In other words, going forward, the Novus Ordo will be the exclusive liturgy of the Roman Rite, and to bring that reality about, I'm putting policies in place now to constrain the practice of the usus antiquior, cutting off its blood supply in the hope that in the near future it just dies away. That could be what he means to say. If it is, that's still a pretty drastic move to make against a long-standing part of the Church's heritage. It's certainly worthy of criticism, and those who would disagree with that decision would have a sound basis for doing so. But once again, literally speaking, Francis seems to be saying more than that he wants to make the Novus Ordo the exclusive liturgical use of the Roman Rite going forward. He also seems to be saying that the usus antiquior of the Roman Rite isn't even an expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite at all. So, according to Francis, the Novus Ordo is the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite, and therefore the usus antiquior does not express the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. What if that is what he means? What's at stake if that's his actual meaning in what he just literally said? Logically speaking, this assertion represents at the very least a purely positivistic way of thinking about the phrase Lex Orandi. In other words, the thing is what we say it is, and nothing else. That's significant because the phrase Lex Orandi has never been used in purely positivistic terms before. If this is really what Francis means, then his definition here seems to be completely novel, and more importantly, turns the meaning of the phrase completely around. The phrase Lex Orandi has been employed by theologians for about 1600 years, when St. Prosper of Aquitaine, who served as a secretary to Pope Celestine I, said, Legem credendi lex statuat supplicandi, or the law of believing is established by the law of supplication. Prosper's principle was later summarized with the words Lex Orandi lex credendi, or the law of praying is the law of believing. Prosper appealed to the way Christians throughout the Church have always prayed as theological evidence for what the faith of the Church is. Let's be clear. His point was that if you want to know what the faith of the Church is, if you want to know what Christians actually believe, then you'll listen to the way we pray, because our prayers give voice to what we believe. Prosper correctly identified an important principle for doing theology responsibly. When we appeal to the Church's constant tradition, the way Christians pray is part of that. At Mass and in the other sacraments as celebrated according to the Church's wide variety of ritual expressions, in widespread and long-standing customary devotions, and as witnessed in the writings of the saints, for example, in the Confessions of St. Augustine. That's all evidence theologians use to determine what the faith of the Church really is. We pray for the dead, for example, in every church of apostolic origin, because we believe that the dead could benefit from those prayers. And since the Church has always and everywhere prayed for the dead, we know that this belief isn't just a narrowly held opinion, but the faith of the whole Church. Lex Orandi, Lex Credendi. That's what the phrase means traditionally. Francis' use of the phrase Lex Orandi can't possibly mean the same thing theologians have traditionally meant by it from the time of St. Prosper until now. We know that because he ties it specifically to the Novus Ordo, which didn't exist until 1970. Prosper isn't talking about the way Christians are allowed to pray, but the way they do pray, and have, in his estimation, always prayed. He's not talking about how they pray only in recent times, but from time immemorial, and not only according to one particular set of liturgical books. Prosper himself would never have used the phrase, the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite, because his concept of Lex Orandi wasn't the concept of a narrowly circumscribed, legislatively defined ritual framework, but of tradition, the prayers that, as a matter of fact, Christians have prayed for hundreds of years, on the basis of which we find evidence of orthodox belief. In his own motu proprio, Summorum Pontificum, which Francis now abrogates, Pope Benedict quoted the Missale Romanum to make this exact point. As from time immemorial, so too in the future it is necessary to maintain the principle that each particular church must be in accord with the universal church, not only regarding the doctrine of the faith and sacramental signs, but also as to the usages universally received from apostolic and unbroken tradition. These are to be observed not only so that errors may be avoided, but also that the faith may be handed on in its integrity, since the Church's rule of prayer, Lex Orandi, corresponds to her rule of faith, Lex Credendi. Notice how the principle is stated. The Church has to be united in the usages universally received from apostolic and unbroken tradition, so that the faith can be handed on in its integrity, because the law of praying corresponds to the law of faith. We pray as we believe. If you want to know what we believe, you want to know how we pray. If you want to hand on, traducere, our beliefs, then hand on our prayers, the usages universally received from apostolic and unbroken tradition, not just the ones drawn up by a liturgical commission in the late 1960s. So the distinction I'm making here is critical. In Prosper's use of the phrase legem credendi lex statuat supplicandi, or lex orandi lex credendi, the ancient tradition of prayer in the Church is itself authoritative, and those who by virtue of their office exercise authority in the name of the Church are responsible to that tradition. They could make refinements in the way the liturgy is celebrated, but they can't just scrap the tradition. In Francis' use of the phrase, by contrast, the way Christians pray is entirely determined by the legislative fiat of those who, by virtue of their office, exercise authority in the church. And the tradition, the way in fact Christians have prayed for hundreds of years, is answerable to those authorities. And among them, the Pope stands supreme. He determines how Christians pray. Not only does this approach prioritize external obedience over interior unity, substituting coercive force for the voluntary assent that arises from genuine charity, it's hard to see how Francis' use of the phrase Lex Orandi could be reconciled with what Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, called a hermeneutic of continuity. Rather, it seems to be the articulation and practical implementation of what he called a hermeneutic of discontinuity, or a hermeneutic of rupture. Let me explain what these phrases mean, and then why Francis' definition of Lex Orandi falls where it does. Again, if what he literally said is actually what he means. A hermeneutic of continuity is a way of interpreting what the authorities in the church say or decree on the presumption that it's meant to be in harmony with tradition. In other words, if I interpret some teaching of the church, say in a papal encyclical or in the documents of an ecumenical council, as contradicting established church teaching or as departing from the tradition that had been passed down to us from time immemorial, my interpretation of what's being said must be wrong, and I have to read the document in such a way that what the church had said before and how Christians have always believed and prayed and lived until now are still true and valid. By contrast, the hermeneutic of discontinuity, or the hermeneutic of rupture, is a way of interpreting recent teaching and discipline in the church, in particular since the Second Vatican Council, as a sea change, a paradigmatic shift and a break from the past. For example, you'll often hear people speak of the Second Vatican Council simply as the Council, as if it should be seen as a council to end all councils, or as the first and so far only council of a new and altogether different church from the one that had existed on 11 October 1962 when it opened. Benedict had consistently rejected this view of the Second Vatican Council because, in essence, it's a rejection of the very idea of unchanging truth, or at least that the church possesses some privileged access to such truth as concerns the meaning of divine revelation and those matters of faith and morals about which she teaches in light of it. Instead, a hermeneutic of rupture replaces this idea with a purely positivistic understanding of religious truth, which in turn replaces an authoritative magisterium with an authoritarian one. Religious truth is what we say it is right now, no matter what anyone else had said before, however many times, however widely taught, for however many centuries. On this view, which Benedict saw as deeply errant and dangerous, the magisterium doesn't safeguard tradition. It decides what it's going to be, and in fact, in the late 19th century, when the anti-Catholic German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck disparaged papal primacy and infallibility as meaning exactly that, Pope Pius IX pronounced against his interpretation of the dogma. Yet this is precisely the sense one gets from a declaration that the Mass of Paul VI is the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. Remember, the usus antiquior is a liturgical form which, with a few relatively minor periodic revisions, had remained in continuous but not exclusive use in the Roman Rite for at least 1,500 years before the Novus Ordo was introduced, an event which for its part occurred just a little over 50 years ago. And yet this usus antiquior, Pope Francis tells us, is not, and can no longer be seen as, an authentic expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite, because Francis has determined motu proprio, that is, by the impulse of his own will, that the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite is the Novus Ordo. Again, if the Novus Ordo is the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite, then by definition, no other liturgical form can express that Lex Orandi. The logical implications of this assertion are staggering. If the usus antiquior can't express the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite, then what we call the Roman Rite today not just the particular liturgy, but the actual framework of tradition, isn't the same thing as what we called the Roman Rite in 1962. Yet that attitude is exactly what Francis says he wants to correct. The only way that's not a contradiction is if the decision flowing from his own subjective will defines what the truth is in the objective order of reality. Again, that's pure positivism. There's only one Roman Rite, and its Lex Orandi is only expressed in the Novus Ordo, even though the Novus Ordo is only about 3% as old as the Rite whose Lex Orandi it alone expresses. What an astonishing thing to say! Did the Roman Rite exist for 15 centuries without an authentic expression of its Lex Orandi? That would be impossible by any accepted meaning of the word rite in Catholic parlance. You can't have a rite without a Lex Orandi. That's like having a quadrangle without corners. It's part of the definition of the thing. Appeals to prior precedent don't work. In the past, when popes unilaterally imposed liturgical uses on certain regions of the world, they did so to establish uniform liturgical practice where none had existed before because the people there had only recently converted. Or they did so to displace liturgical uses that had become so corrupted by accretion and expressive of heretical theological opinions that too little remained of their integrity to be saved. That's what Pope Pius V had done when he suppressed the liturgical uses in the Roman Rite that didn't pre-exist the controversies that had resulted in the catastrophe of the Protestant Reformation. In his explanatory letter, Francis declares that all the elements of the Roman Rite could be found in the Novus Ordo, but in stating that the Novus Ordo is the unique expression of the Roman Rite, he's declaring that not all the elements of the Roman Rite can be found in the Usus Antiquior, and that its deficiencies in this regard make it unrecognizable as an expression of that rite. Francis is saying that the Usus Antiquior is fatally defective as an expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. That means he's classifying the Usus Antiquior as the kind of corrupt variant of the Roman Rite Pope Pius V had suppressed in 1570 when he made that very liturgy, the liturgy Francis is now suppressing, normative in their place. Francis appeals to Pius's action as a precedent, but once again, Pius didn't suppress every liturgical variant in the Roman Rite other than the one he wished especially to promote. He only restored a more purified and slightly revised form of a pre-existing Roman Rite to regions that had lost their own ritual integrity. That's not what Francis is doing. In his explanatory letter, he explicitly notes that Pius V only suppressed those liturgies in the Roman Rite that couldn't trace their antiquity. By contrast, Francis is suppressing the Usus Antiquior, a use of the Roman Rite that has existed for at least 1,500 years, saying that there's only one expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite, and the Usus Antiquior isn't it. The Usus Antiquior doesn't express the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite, regardless of the fact that it was prayed by the faithful within that rite for over a millennium and a half. Remember, Lex Orandi, Lex Credendi means that the way we pray reveals what we believe. So to say that this way of praying doesn't express the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite is to say that the faith confessed in the Roman Rite is a different faith from before, which until now we'd all just assume, perhaps naively, was the Catholic faith. Again, if Lex Orandi, Lex Credendi, if what we believe is reflected in the way we pray, then the faith of the Roman Rite of the post-Vatican II Church isn't the faith witnessed in the Usus Antiquior. The faith Roman Catholics had always thought they shared with Byzantine and Ukrainian, Melkite, Maronite, and Chaldean Catholics, but some other faith. If it were the same, then the Usus Antiquior would express it, and Francis says it doesn't. If that's so, then the liturgies of the Usus Antiquior and the Novus Ordo, respectively, are the liturgies not only of two different rites, but of two different faiths. They're two different religions. On this view, either the Roman Catholic Church was adrift in heresy for at least 1,500 years, or the Roman Catholic Church fell into it in 1965. That's a hermeneutic of rupture, if ever there was one, and it leaves us with two untenable alternatives. Now, before we go any further with this commentary, there are a few points we want to keep in mind. In the Catholic tradition, a motu proprio derives its force of law from the will of the legislator alone. An error in the general views of the legislator or in his reasoning doesn't have any legal bearing on the binding nature of a motu proprio. Here, we're really only concerned with the theological claim that the Novus Ordo is the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. And we should keep in mind that a motu proprio isn't in any respect a teaching document. If there's a doctrinal error in the motu proprio, it can't constitute a formally heretical teaching unless it specifically directs the teaching of a heresy. And finally, the Church's claim concerning the infallibility of the Pope isn't a claim that the Pope can't fall into error in this kind of a context. So, if we're to take Francis' words at face value, if what he means is what he actually said, the Pope has traced out the line of a schism. On the one side is the faith of the Church that opened the Second Vatican Council in 1962. On the other side, the Church that closed it in 1965. Until now, most generally conservative Catholics, whether they prayed according to the Usus Antiquior or the Novus Ordo, didn't see things that way. Pope Paul VI didn't, neither did Pope John Paul I, who chose his pontifical name to represent the continuity of the Church on either side of the recent council. Nor certainly John Paul II, who picked up the same baton and carried it for 27 years. And I've explained already and at length what Benedict XVI had thought and why. So in saying that the Mass of Paul VI is the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite, something no pope in history has ever said about a newly drafted liturgical text, he's saying exactly what can't be said. The faith reflected in the Usus Antiquior is not an expression of the faith of the Roman Rite. In Summorum Pontificum, Pope Benedict XVI had said, and I quote, "The Roman Missal promulgated by Pope Paul VI is the ordinary expression of the Lex Orandi rule of prayer of the Catholic Church of the Latin Rite. The Roman Missal promulgated by St. Pius V and revised by Blessed John XXIII is nonetheless to be considered an extraordinary expression of the same Lex Orandi of the Church and duly honored for its venerable and ancient usage. These two expressions of the Church's Lex Orandi will in no way lead to a division in the Church's Lex Credendi, rule of faith, for they are two usages of the one Roman Rite. Following Prosper of Aquitaine, Benedict is saying that because the Church's Lex Orandi expresses the Lex Credendi, variant expressions of the Lex Orandi of the same rite can't possibly divide the Lex Credendi, from which they both flow and which each expresses in its own way. Contrast this with what Francis says about the same objective content, that is, the Usus Antiquior and the Novus Ordo, in relation to the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. The liturgical books promulgated by St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II in conformity with the decrees of Vatican Council II are the unique expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. Objectively speaking, these two assertions are in manifest contradiction. Francis' statement is logically equivalent to the statement in categorical logic, all expressions of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite are the Novus Ordo. Benedict's statement is equivalent to the categorical statement, some expressions of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite are not the Novus Ordo. Or, by way of conversion, Benedict's statement is equivalent to the statement, some expressions of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite are not the Novus Ordo. Francis' statement is equivalent to the statement, no expressions of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite are not the Novus Ordo. This is what Francis' words literally mean. At the time of this recording, an official Latin text of his motu proprio has yet to be published, but the Italian, which seems to be the language of the original document, which Francis has already ordered to take effect, says, "l'unica espressione," which carries precisely the sense I've taken it to convey in this commentary, that the Novus Ordo is the only expression of the Lex Orandi of the Roman Rite. Now, in categorical logic, where we discover a contradiction, we know that we've actually discovered some truth, because the two statements relate to one another in such a way that One of them must be false and the other must be true. Which one is which may be difficult to determine, but we know two things for sure about them, that they can't both be true, and also that they can't both be false. So is Pope Francis wrong? If he is, that's a big problem, because it means he's taking aim at the very faith and tradition the Mass of Paul VI is meant to reflect, and in doing so, undermining the same Lex Orandi of that liturgy. If, by contrast, Francis is right and Benedict was wrong, we have a much, much bigger problem, because it means that the tiny radical fringe elements Francis seeks to destroy have been right in their diagnosis of what ails us all along. In either case, if Francis means what he actually said, it's clear he shares with his ecclesial enemies the same view of the situation, the view that the liturgical reforms that followed the Second Vatican Council reflect a sharp break with tradition, and a departure from what nearly everyone else in the Church had always seen as the holy faith of the Fathers. Of course, once again, it's entirely possible that Francis doesn't mean what he literally said. In fact, if we listen to him from the perspective of a hermeneutic of continuity, he can't possibly mean what he said. I'm just telling you what the implications would be if he did mean it. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm not playing word games or logic chopping. I'm just explaining what the words Francis wrote in his motu proprio and its explanatory letter literally mean when understood in the context of the history of Catholic theology. Francis may not have intended that meaning, but what I've presented here is the objective, technically precise meaning of the words he used and an analysis of their direct theological implications. And admittedly, I suppose that analysis was probably a bit unsettling. Maybe the Vatican will see fit to offer clarification. Such things have been known to happen. Then again, maybe they won't. It's really up to Pope Francis. But if you like this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ask for notifications, and share our content on social media. Doing so helps us reach a broader audience and hopefully lead more souls to heaven. Again, I'm Dr. Richard Bolzachelli for Catholic Studies Academy. Thanks for watching.